Part of the motivation for wanting to explore a potential basis for a cloud platform was that our infrastructure wasn't unified at the time. We had maybe 4 or 5 different ways that we were running our applications. The team did a experimental cloud platform. It was a success, and within a couple of years, all of Shopify was running on Kubernetes. And I really had just the most amazing experience getting to follow that journey from the beginning.
You are listening to the Kubelist Podcast, a show interviewing project maintainers for open source projects with a focus on CNCF sandbox, incubating, and graduated projects. Hi, I'm Marc Campbell. Together with Benjie DeGroot, we publish the Kubelist newsletter dedicated to Kubernetes and the CNCF ecosystem. I'm the founder and CTO at Replicated, where we enable software vendors such as HashiCorp, Puppet, Harness, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem software. Check us out at replicated.com. Benjie is the co-founder and CEO at Shipyard, where they enable teams of all sizes to build, test, and deploy faster and more reliably via their ephemeral environment management platform. Get started with ephemeral environments at shipyard.build. The Kubelist Podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or you would like to suggest a project, find us on Twitter at ReadKubelist. Finally, sign up for the Kubelist newsletter and read previous issues at kubelist.com. On this episode, Benjie and I are joined by Katrina Verey from Shopify. Katrina starts out by telling us about her non-traditional background and how she got interested in infrastructure. She then goes on to explain how she got involved in the SIG CLI and Kustomize projects. We spend a good amount of time talking about Kustomize, and Katrina is able to share a lot of details about how Shopify manages Kubernetes and infrastructure. This is a fun conversation about configuration management and really just learning a lot from a team that does it well. Enjoy. Hi there. As you just heard, we have Katrina Verey on with us today. Katrina is currently a senior staff software developer and production engineer at Shopify. She's also a project owner and maintainer of Kustomize and a SIG CLI co-chair and tech lead. We're going to have a fun and probably pretty technical conversation today. Before we start, of course, Benjie's here too. Benjie, how's it going?
It's going well. Excited to talk to Katrina. There's a lot of questions to ask.
For sure. All right, let's dive right in here. Katrina, we'd love for you just to start out by telling us a little bit about you and how you ended up working in the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. So my background is maybe a little non-traditional. I actually studied translation in university and worked for the government of Canada for about 5 years in the translation and editing space. And as much as I enjoyed that career, I decided it wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So at that point, I started exploring what other options might make sense for me, and stumbled on a Rails bootcamp. So I actually went to a Rails bootcamp, discovered a love of programming while in that program, and from there managed to get a position at Shopify as a developer advocate intern. In that position, I worked on the Shopify App Store, which is the third-party ecosystem of apps that plug into Shopify for our merchants to use. And I got a lot of really great mentorship as part of that opportunity that really let me solidify my developer skills. From there, I moved on to product work at Shopify. I worked on the orders team and the storefront editor in particular. And I had a mentor during that time because having this non-traditional background, I had a lot of gaps in my knowledge that, filling them would really help me with my growth as a software developer. And my mentor was really helping me with that. And one of the things that he was emphasizing around, let's say, beginning of 2016 was just infrastructure knowledge. So one day he pointed out to me that Hack Days were coming up and that there are a few infrastructure related projects as part of that Hack Days being an opportunity for developers at Shopify to spend a few days experimenting on random projects that don't have anything to do with their normal day-to-day work. So anyway, my mentor was suggesting to me hey, why don't you take this opportunity to join an infrastructure related project and learn something new? I thought, wow, that sounds like a great idea. So I went and I checked out the projects. And the one that stood out to me was basically, let's try this new Kubernetes thing. Let's check it out, see how it works, see if we can run our most important app on it, how that goes for us. I didn't know what Kubernetes was. I had no idea, but it sounded interesting. So I joined that project. I helped out in the ways that I could and learned a lot, but by and large, I would say I had no idea what I was doing. Nevertheless, it was a good learning experience for me and sort of introduced me to what would be an incredibly important concept for my career, because later in that year, folks with way more experience and knowledge than me who are on that team decided that Kubernetes was actually very promising and we should give it a more official try with a small team and try to build out an experiment of what a cloud platform based on Kubernetes could look like. And to my utter surprise, I was invited to join that team, which was just an incredible opportunity. And I was very intimidated by it because, like I said, I had no idea what I was doing. And I felt a huge amount of imposter syndrome around working on anything infrastructure related whatsoever. But I thought, I just couldn't pass up this opportunity to learn and to grow in this area that was really interesting to me. So I joined the team and I never looked back, essentially. So the team did an experimental cloud platform. It was a success. And within a couple of years, all of Shopify was running on Kubernetes. And I really had just the most amazing experience getting to follow that journey from the beginning.
That's great. I like, it's interesting. You actually, one comment there, you said at the beginning, the hack day, you said, can we run our most important app on this new Kubernetes platform that's coming out? Why start with the most important app? Why not start with like something that's like lower risk? Do you have any thoughts about like why you took that approach?
Yeah, so I wasn't my decision at all. That's not my good practice. But I do think it's a very good idea and a practice that we have in production engineering at Shopify to run towards the risk. That's literally the expression that we use. There's going to be risks associated with any project. And the more you know about them, the more that you tackle them up front and discover how much they're going to be a problem and whether or not that problem is tractable, the better that you're going to be in the long run. So instead of hiding them away for later, we tackle them head on right from the start. So, the idea there in this particular case was if we're going to be able to use Kubernetes as the common basis for all of our applications, that's going to need to include Shopify Core, as we call it, which is the most difficult thing for any platform to handle of all the things that we have. So let's find out upfront whether or not that one's going to work.
I love that. That's really a great thing to encourage an engineering team to be, how to approach problems. I have a question for you. Were you guys already containerized at that point in 2016, or was this a bigger lift? If you can share that, what did the infrastructure look like before Kubernetes?
Yeah. Part of the motivation for wanting to explore a potential basis for a cloud platform was that our infrastructure wasn't unified at the time. We had several, maybe 4 or 5 different ways that we were running our applications. But the Shopify Core application that I was talking about, being the first one that we tackled, that one actually was containerized. For that one, we were very early adopters of Docker. And that made it easier to do that experiment, right? Because the containerization piece was already in place. We used a variety of other technologies to run our other applications, which was kind of a problem for us because the lessons that we learned in building for the app that really stretched us in terms of scale and technology, they weren't transferable to these other applications. So we're kind of having to reinvent the wheel and have multiple tools and techniques for maintaining these various things. And not being able to transfer lessons that we've already learned from the big app to the other ones as they scaled. So that was a big motivation in wanting to create a flat platform and finding a common technology that could be the basis for apps of any scale.
I mean, one thing that I know is that I'm pretty sure that Shopify is probably one of the biggest users, if not the biggest user of Kubernetes. I mean, maybe Google and Amazon are maybe bigger users, but you guys are pretty massive users. What does your architecture high level look like today?
Yeah, we certainly are very big users. I don't know how to find out exactly where we rank, but we certainly have a huge amount of clusters and also apps that we run on those clusters. When we first started building the platform, we had sort of a vision that we would have a smaller number of really large clusters with massive multi-tenancy and co-location of various kinds of workloads. The original sort of experimental version of the platform mostly just made a distinction based on quality of service, which actually did work out for us pretty well and is still a feature to some extent of the architecture that we have today, where the experimental apps don't live alongside of most business critical ones. But our experience over time taught us that it actually can work better to have a smaller number of clusters that are more uniform in terms of the type of thing that they run. So we no longer co-locate stateless and stateful workloads, and we actually are moving towards treating clusters as disposable as much as possible. And instead of investing in tooling to make upgrades seamless, we invest in tooling to make applications resilient to being transferred to another cluster. So that same tooling is then able to be used both when we want to do a cluster upgrade, because that actually looks like spinning up a new one on the new version and moving the applications over to it, the same way as we can apply that tooling to a failover scenario. So we end up with these really robust resiliency tools for applications that are applicable in both scenarios. As a result of this re-architecture, we now have a really massive fleet of clusters. The number is actually more than 400, which is pretty crazy. So another thing that we've invested in is tooling for managing those clusters as a fleet.
So yeah, 400 clusters is a lot. Are those all like, you said you're like really focused on trying to have like some uniformity. Is that inside the cluster, or like, do you really have like a platform team that says, oh, great, you need another cluster or another dozen clusters? Like we like, it's very easy for us to create additional clusters.
It is really easy for us to create additional clusters for sure. That's something that wasn't always the case, and we invested heavily in a few years ago to make that possible. Right now, we're still improving our notion of having sets of clusters that follow a uniform topology that we've defined for them, so that it's not 400 different clusters, it's 400 clusters divided into a smaller number of well-defined shapes. So in terms of like what I meant by collocating certain types of workloads and separating others is that we might have one of those shapes be application clusters, and that would run the stateless component specifically of the applications, that the end users of our platform want to run. And then I should mention, we run everything on Kubernetes. Didn't emphasize that enough earlier. We run everything from stateless to stateful services that are the components of our platform, all on that common technology. So some of the other clusters that we have are dedicated to a specific shape of stateful system. For example, we might have one dedicated to MySQL or Redis or Memcache, Elasticsearch, Kafka, and so on, all those other services that we run. And then we have some understanding of what's in that cluster and what it takes to move it to the new one for the purposes of upgrades. That also gives us, all those aren't owned by the application teams. The application teams just, they end up using one of the application clusters based on the opinionated platform tooling that we provide. And the clusters, such as the ones that run our stateful systems, are owned by the stateful services teams that provide those systems as a service to our internal customers.
So if I'm on the application team and I want to use Kafka service, am I connecting across cluster, or how does that? I want to understand how that works, or any other service, any type of database service or whatever. Just because you obviously have these clusters are isolated from each other to some degree. How do you bridge that? How as an application developer do I get a service that maybe is in a different shaped cluster?
Right. So we have heavily made use of the pattern of custom resources as a way to declaratively request infrastructure. And the way that often works today is that the application owner would have a custom resource in their cluster alongside their stateless application resources that would request either the creation or just access to a stateful system that might exist elsewhere. And then the controller that's backing that custom resource is going to take a look at that and say, they need access to the MySQL, they need access to Redis. And it's going to set up a specially configured proxy to allow the app in question to connect to that service wherever it may live. And that obviously includes validating that the app is supposed to be able to access that service and that it owns it, and then setting up all of the secure configuration required to get it to connect wherever that might live.
Cool. We're talking about Shopify and how you're currently running infrastructure and the path to get there. Like, I want to definitely come back to that. But another interesting topic I want to transition to for a second, or for maybe more than a second, is you're a project owner and a maintainer of Kustomize. Like, I'd love to hear more about Kustomize. Like, can you tell us like what's the inspiration for Kustomize? Maybe for folks who aren't super familiar with it, like even just like a high level overview of what Kustomize does.
Sure. Kustomize is a configuration management tool that you can use straight from KubeControl. It's embedded in KubeControl as KubeControl Kustomize. And The purpose is really to satisfy the basic configuration management needs of managing variants that you might have for your application. Most folks who are deploying to Kubernetes have various shapes of their application that they might need to manage, and Kustomize is designed to fill that need.
It makes sense. I mean, I've used Kustomize. I remember like the first time it came out, it was like a new take on a really hard problem, right? Like there's other tools in the CNCF ecosystem that attempt to solve this problem using different ways. One that comes to mind is Helm. I think there's like a proliferation of like config management tools these days, and Kustomize has a very opinionated, specific solution for it.
Definitely. And like Kustomize specifically is motivated by the desire to provide a very Kubernetes native declarative configuration management workflow for end users of Kubernetes to take advantage of. It was actually motivated, from what I understand, I was not around in the project at the time, but from what I understand, it was motivated by identifying a shortcoming of kubectl that it had no declarative solution for this really common problem of needing to make simple transformations ahead of deploying your workloads to Kubernetes. Like it had kubectl patch, kubectl label, all these imperative commands for making those transformations, but the best practice is to have completely declarative workflow from start to finish when it comes to configuration management. And kubectl didn't give our users any way to approach that problem.
When you think about adding that on top of kubectl, that makes total sense. At the time that Kustomize came out, I think if I remember the timelines right, it was like Helm existed for sure. Some of the other things that are available here in 2022 maybe were not available yet. Like there's definitely some stuff there. So how do you think about like the way that Kustomize solves the problem of giving the users the ability to do that like last mile configuration versus the way Helm does it? Like what are if you can kind of talk a little bit about the strengths of the way Kustomize does it, and maybe like Helm still exists and Helm's continued to grow in popularity just like Kustomize has. And so like Helm clearly is solving a problem that folks have too. Can you share a little bit of your thoughts as to like where each of the project strengths are?
Yeah, the configuration management space is really rich and diverse. It was before Kustomize existed, and it still is today. And I don't really see that changing, to be honest. There are a lot of different tools in the space that come with different opinions and that will work better in different situations than others. And there's really not going to be a silver bullet, and Kustomize isn't trying to be one. I don't think any great tool is going to be built to address every possible use case, because great tools tend to have strong opinions about one way to approach a problem. I think Kustomize's approach is pretty novel at the time. Helm takes a templating-based approach, which is fairly common across the space, and Kustomize specifically doesn't do that. If you want to learn about the philosophy behind Kustomize, which I think is actually pretty interesting, but I'm biased on that topic, there is a document called Declarative Application Management in Kubernetes, which was written by Brian Grant in 2017, Brian Grant from Google. And that document really is an overview of the configuration management space that is just super insightful into the possible approaches and the trade-offs that come with them. So when I was working on configuration management internally at Shopify, I discovered this document and was just super inspired by it. And I think it can be useful for folks who maintain configuration tools or folks who are just trying to make a decision about what's best for their organization to take a look at something like that, which is a very thorough overview, to sort of get a good understanding of what the possibilities are and the trade-offs they come with.
Yep. We'll include a link to that document in the show notes because it is really it is absolutely worth reading if you're like trying to like figure out how to like make your application configurable or deploy an application to Kubernetes.
Yeah. And one thing I would say about the difference between Kustomize and Helm is that they really have very different scopes. So they have in common that they both have a configuration management solution, but Kustomize is solely focused on configuration management, and it is specifically focused on being a solution that is incredibly Kubernetes native and only deliberately exposes the Kubernetes APIs themselves in a purely declarative and configuration as data approach. Whereas Helm is a lot more than that. It has a template-based configuration management built in, but it also is a full-fledged package manager that helps you define, distribute, and release your packages. And that is just completely out of scope for Kustomize. It's not something that's ever been a part of the Kustomize project or anything that we're interested in doing. So that said, you can use these tools together as well. You can use post render hooks in Helm to invoke Kustomize, or you can do the other way around, where you start off with a Helm chart as your starting point, and then you import that into Kustomize using its Helm feature to then make all of your transformations, create your variants, whatever it is that you need to do using Kustomize's declarative style.
Do you like that? Have you seen a bunch of setups like that? What would you suggest if I was just getting started with Kustomize?
It depends on what you have to begin with. If you are starting with a Helm chart, certainly that is a very approachable way to get started, and I like Kustomize is really focused on making it easy to make these common transformations. So if that's exactly what you need to do, then plugging your Helm chart into Kustomize and just defining those simple transformations you need to make is a really great way to go. Ultimately, if you end up doing something more complex with Kustomize, you might want to render out that chart into your directory and set up a more Kustomize-oriented system overall. If you're just getting started and you don't have any configuration defined to begin with, or you just have a plain set of Kubernetes resources, I would suggest starting with Kustomize directly, which is very simple to do because it's really oriented around those resources. All you need to do is drop them into a directory, add a customization.yaml beside them that imports them, and then define those declarative transformations that you want to make. Yeah,
so really, if I'm starting from scratch, Kustomize, in your opinion, not biased at all, of course, is the way to begin. But yeah, okay, no, that's super interesting, and there's a lot of nuance here, and I think that I'm very excited to read through that doc actually. So I'm going to be looking at the show notes for sure.
Yeah, it's about 5 years old now, so it doesn't have all of the tools that exist today, and some other ones are also inspired by it. There's another one by Google called Kept that was also derived from this similar philosophy, but its principles that it outlines there are certainly still pretty comprehensive and very informative.
Totally. So at Shipyard, we're big users of Helm. I'm pretty sure that at Replicated, they're big users of Kustomize. Not that we're trying to start a turf war here, but tell me more about this Helm feature. I had no idea. You just mentioned a Helm feature that I could use, and I want to understand that one more. What was that?
Yeah. So most of the features in Kustomize, you could frame as being either generating or transforming configuration. And one of the features that we have is based on generating configuration with the Helm chart as a starting point. So there is a Helm field that you can specify where you point us to your chart and some of the parameters needed to render it. And Kustomize will render that out. It's actually shelling out to the Helm command that you have installed on your machine, Helm v3. And it just uses that to get that raw configuration set to use as the starting point for the transformations that you're going to make with Kustomize. That said, because we are relying on an external executable, there are some trade-offs to keep in mind with this, which is that you need to make that available. And you're going to need to specify an additional set of flags to tell us that, yes, you really want us to invoke this specific executable and you believe it's safe and it's actually Helm and, for the security purposes, which makes it a little less convenient to use. And because of that, we actually have a plan that is documented in issue on the Kustomize repo for moving the Kustomize integration into the new extensions format called KRM Functions, which is another sub-project that I lead within SIG CLI. And that the idea there is that you can encapsulate it in a container, and then we can provide the Helm binary that gets run. And you can just approve the fact that we want to run Helm. So that's a little ways out still, but that's kind of the direction we're headed with it. And then we can provide a more complete Helm feature set because we'll be building something that is even more focused on providing that integration and making it complete.
It's cool. Yeah. Well, like the KRM stuff looks interesting. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, hold on. This is Mark. This is the most important question that I like to ask. Oh. Katrina, kube cuddle or kube control?
I say it 3 different ways, and I think most of the SIG CLI maintainers now also just kind of say whatever comes to mind in the moment. As somebody asked us this at KubeCon actually during our session, there's an old release note that I think says kube control. It says one thing or another that is not the same thing as what is implied by our new logo from a few years ago, which shows a cuttlefish, strongly implying that it's kube cuddle.
The right answer is kube cuddle. I just want everyone to know that. just based on it. It sounds so nice.
The right answer.
The right answer. I'm an advocate on listeners of the podcast know that I am on a mission to make sure it is kubectl. We are going to win this fight. So, Katrina, the right answer is kubectl, just so you know.
Oh, okay. Thank you for telling me.
Wait, tell me more about this KRM stuff. I don't know anything about this. What is this?
Yeah. So if you want to get more details, there's some talks available from both the maintainer session at this past KubeCon and Jeff Reagan, the previous maintainer of Kustomize, and I spoke about how to use them in Kustomize specifically in depth at the North America KubeCon from last year. KRM functions is a format essentially for defining declarative extensions for configuration management tools. Well, what does that mean? So KRM stands for Kubernetes Resource Model. And that means that we want to build pieces of code that are going to affect configuration management transformations based on a declarative state expressed as a Kubernetes resource. So in a way, Kustomize itself follows this exact model because customization is a Kubernetes resource, and Kustomize, the tool, takes that Kubernetes resource as its declarative instructions for what it needs to produce. So the KRM function specification describes how you, as someone who wants to extend a configuration management like Kustomize, it's also supported by Kept, can adhere to the same principles and build an extension that really integrates really nicely into these tools. Did that make sense?
That does make sense. So it doesn't depend on the Kubernetes API server. It's a way to distribute and execute that. But like the interesting part too is, as far as the security model goes and a few other kind of side effects you get and benefits really are like the KRM functions, I guess, is that what you call them, are packaged as containers?
Yeah, the recommended distribution mechanism is containers. It's not the only one that's supported. You can build a KRM function that is implemented with an executable. We recognize that there are some situations, such as very CI related contexts, where you actually cannot run a container, which puts a serious limitation on us if we were to restrict the format to that exclusively. So from a security standpoint, certainly container is the best option if that's a possibility. What we're working on is a concept called catalog that would enable you to, as a user of KRM functions extensions, so a Kustomize user that wants to incorporate extensions, to tell Kustomize that you want to run these specific ones and to be able to list out what those are supposed to look like. So what container can run them or what executable can run them, and whether or not you as the end user prefer one or the other. That way with it's a full metadata format. So you are able to, as the person who is authoring these for publication, and then as the end user who wants to consume them, specify, exact checksums that you expect the binary to have so that Kustomize can validate that for you before running it. Then when you're defining your customization and you're saying, I want to run, my company generator, you can just say my company generator, and Kustomize can look up which one that is, see that you've approved it in your catalog that you've included, and then just run it seamlessly for you.
Wow.
That's a bit of a tangent.
No. That's great. So what is the timeline on KRM functions and all that stuff? When do you think that the implementation might be there, or the spec is finished at least?
The spec is pretty solid at this point. It's actually pretty simple when it comes down to it. The spec says that you have to use the Kubernetes resource model to describe the intended functionality. And then your program has to accept a list in a certain format on standard in and emit that same format on standard out so that these KRM functions are composable. But it's very easy to comply with. Basically, what it looks like from the perspective of the person writing the function is you take in an object called a resource list that has a field for the list of resources that you are supposed to transform or add to. And then a field with that function configuration, which is the declarative KRM object that the end user is expressing their intent with. So telling you what to generate or what transformation to make. Then you do whatever it is you want to do in your program to make that happen. And you spit out the same resource list format on the other end with the new list of items that has the transformations or generations or even validations applied to it. So the The format, I think, is pretty solid. The plan for around catalog to make this easier to use in the tools that adopt KRM functions as the format for their extensions, those are still more work in progress. We have KEPs that describe the plan for them, but we need more folks to join us to work on the implementation and help give us feedback to make sure that what we graduate in terms of the extensions is something that is going to work for the real world use cases that folks have.
Cool. And I think that, we don't want to spend the whole time talking about KRM functions. I mean, they're super interesting. And I've kind of been reading through the spec. I found it in the Kustomize repo here as you've been explaining it. And we'll definitely include a link. I think one thing that can help a little bit, it is a pretty advanced topic that you're clearly building to solve a specific problem. Can you give like an example maybe of where KRM functions would make a current process a lot easier to do?
Two examples that we have recommended folks build extensions for are features that we don't want to add to Kustomize core, but that fill a use case that folks have in their organization. So say they need to make a really specific transformation that involves knowing something about the way that organization structures its resources. That's not something that we can accept in Kustomize in particular, because we only make structured transformations. We never use any mechanism like templating or regex to identify unstructured locations to edit. So when you have that knowledge, you can build that into your own transformer and have your end users give you the information that you need to do that transformation accurately and do it then behind the scenes however you would like. Another example is that some folks want Kustomize to emit resources in a specific order for deploy readiness reasons, for review reasons, whatever it may be. And it doesn't correspond to one of the two ordering strategies that Kustomize supports. Well, in that case, you can implement a transformer that you add at the end of the list that just takes in the list, reorders it into that order that you wanted, and emits it so that the final order that Kustomize emits is exactly the one you want. Another use case for KRM functions that really resonates with me in particular is the one where you have an organization with strong opinions on what configuration should look like, or a need to produce abstractions for your end users to declare a more specific or a more organization specific desired state. So for example, maybe you have a standard app shape that all your customers use to get started, and it takes 5 different parameters that are specific to your organization. Well, you can make a generator as a KRM function that takes in those 5 parameters and gives them that starting point that they can then use with the standard Kustomize primitives to take it from there to customize it to their own needs. And in essence, Shopify actually does take this strategy. Our configuration management system predates KRM functions, but it was inspired by the Declarative Application Management in Kubernetes document and bears a lot of similarities to the way that KRM functions are structured and built. In fact, we used the KML library, a very, very early version of it, as part of our implementation. And our configuration generation tool, although we do use it standalone, is compatible as a Kustomize generator. And that was intentionally so. And I think proves out that point that this is a really powerful mechanism for folks who really like Kustomize's approach, but have more organizational bespoke needs to address.
Mm-hmm. Totally. So, I mean, we kind of got a little ahead of ourselves, but this is a great place to go back. How did you get involved in Kustomize, especially being at Shopify? Can you tell us just a little bit how kind of OSS works there? And how you got to get involved in Kustomize itself and all that stuff.
Shopify is a really open source friendly company. We really believe in investing in the open source software that we depend on, and we have a long history of doing so, in particular for Ruby, Rails, and React. Historically, we haven't been as involved in Kubernetes, but we're really excited to be doing more in that space as well these days. I would say that personally, I was always excited about the idea of being involved, but all those years in the past, I never really knew how to get started. Never found the right approach. And while I was working on configuration management, building the product to make configuration management tractable for our app platform, I went to a KubeCon and had the privilege of being introduced to Phil Whitrock, who was one of the tech leads of SIG CLI at the time, and also leads of the Kustomize project in particular. And I was super excited about configuration management at the time, right? I'd been working on this project for a while. We were sort of getting ready to ship it. I had all of these ideas about how it can work. And Phil was also really excited to chat about that topic since it was close to his heart as well. So that's how I started to find my place in the community, by being able to connect to somebody who is working on the same sort of problems that I was working on in my day to day. And for some reason, I don't know why, it had never occurred to me that SIG CLI was the SIG that was working on the same stuff that I was. I had always thought it was maybe SIG apps. I'd kind of gone to their meetings, but never really found a common ground. I gave a demo there once, but that was about it. And when I found SIG CLI through these conversations, I was just like, wow, why didn't I realize this sooner? And from there, I started just making a few little contributions. And eventually I ended up having the opportunity, we didn't touch on this, but I joined Apple briefly for about 1.5 years. And part of my role there was working on SIG CLI stuff as well. I've had very continuity of subject matter in the last years of my career here. And while I was there, I also did a lot of work with Phil, and was able to even further deepen my involvement with SIG CLI and with Kustomize in particular.
You know, one thing that's interesting, like going back to that declarative application management white paper that you mentioned, that Brian Grant wrote. You know, back in 2017 when he wrote it, you know, you're working to solve these problems at Shopify. Lots of different people are. Google is. Brian works at Google. The one sentence, like, you know, it's a really great paper, but the one sentence that really struck me was he talked about how, you know, look, we've been working on this for years at Google. We've tried a lot of stuff. Like, we still don't really think there's a good solution yet. So it kind of like gives you confidence that, like, you're not missing something obvious. Like, everybody's trying to solve this problem. Configuration management is just hard in general. Mm-hmm. And so you're motivated, like, you're solving this problem. You realize like there are a lot of folks out there trying to solve this problem. So you start to work on it. How did you get involved enough to become, like, you know, now you're a project owner of Kustomize? You know, you went from, you know, working on the project, you know, making PRs into it, I assume. And then eventually said, like, look, I'm going to really focus a lot of my time. I'm going to take some responsibilities here and really drive this project forward.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I started getting involved by contributing features here and there, making fixes, talking to the maintainers about the work that I was doing in the space. And what really got me most deeply involved was actually the KRM functions angle, and sort of what I was talking about regarding the power of these to address so many different use cases. And you can even use them independently, like Shopify does, where we have something that could be used as a KRM function extension for Kustomize, but in practice, we use it independently. So these things it's a way to build these composable units of configuration tooling that can serve such a wide variety of use cases while adhering to these great principles outlined in declarative application management. So I was really excited about that concept, and contributed a KEP for a resource called Composition. It's still not merged yet. There's an implementation up in a PR, but this is something that is intended to make these, if you will, third-party resources defined as extensions for Kustomize to be more first-class citizens of Kustomize and be mixed in alongside the built-in generators and transformers to make, in particular, variant management when you're using both built-ins and external generators and transformers, a better experience. So that was my first really major contribution. And to do that effectively, I had to really deepen my knowledge of Kustomize as a tool and the implementation.
So how is the Kustomize community going now? Now, fast forward a few years, and how's it going? How many people are involved? What do you need help with? What you know, we have an audience here. So what are you looking for? How can we be supportive of the Kustomize project?
We have a very small team right now. I maintain Kustomize with Natasha Sarkar from Google. And we have another person, Anna, who has just begun to join us recently, which we're really excited about. So welcome, Anna. We have such a wide user base that we really need more folks than just three of us working on the project. So if you are a big fan of Kustomize, if you rely on it and are interested in helping us make the tool better for the long term, we would really like folks like you to step up and join, I guess, the contributor ladder to help us maintain this software and have the bandwidth really to do more of the exciting plans that we have on our roadmap.
So wait, by the way, so Shopify is using Kustomize today in production, correct?
No.
Interesting. One day, once KRM is in place, they might be.
Probably not, honestly. One of the things that Kustomize isn't particularly intended to be is for a tool for opinionated platforms like the one that Shopify has. So our configuration management tool is inspired by the same thing. It works on the same principles. It looks just like a KRM extension, and perhaps we'll use it from within Kustomize as part of it for some advanced use case in the future. But where these two things come together is really at that philosophical level and in terms of the foundational tooling that's used to build them. So the thing that we have internally, it's also built on KYAML, and it is also a Kubernetes resource model declarative approach.
I mean, that speaks to a pretty awesome Shopify open source thing there, that you're working on this much and they're not even using it. That's really cool.
Yeah, and of course, I don't work on Kustomize exclusively. I am involved in SIG CLI more generally. And the goal of my team is really to connect Shopify to the upstream community in ways that make sense for us. And this is one case where Shopify has a ton of expertise in this space. We have so much experience doing configuration management strategies at scale. And the community has a serious need for folks who have that experience to step up and maintain these tools to help them make them sustainable for the long term. So this is a place that it makes sense for us to help out. And that is really part of our mission, is to help contribute to the sustainability of the Kubernetes project in ways that make sense for us and our expertise.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm sure it'd be great if you were able to say, like, yeah, I can fix this in Kustomize and make our internal Shopify systems work better. But like so it kind of forces you to kind of bring everything up one level higher, where you're really thinking about configuration management, not the implementation of Kustomize to solve Shopify's problem.
Yes, although those things do certainly come together, and even in the concrete implementation of the KYAML library, which increasingly, like, Kustomize is a wrapper around KYAML, and KYAML is, I haven't really explained it properly yet. It's basically a toolkit for manipulating YAML that specifically is expressing Kubernetes resources. It's this really great tool, and we do a lot of client-side work at Shopify, and the KYAML tool is really helpful tool to have in our tool belt for that. And we can help evolve that one based on our experience, which also helps Kustomize, because Kustomize is built entirely around it.
Is KYAML just a Go library, a Go package, or is it a totally separate?
Yeah, it's a Go package that currently still lives inside of the Kustomize repository.
Okay.
And the KRM function strategy, we didn't build our tool out of the KYAML functions framework, which is a subpackage of the KYAML tool, just because it didn't exist yet. If we were to restart today, building what we have would be so much easier. Oh my gosh, it would be so much easier. And if I had been in the community working on this stuff at the time that I built the internal solution, it would have been even better, honestly. There's so much benefit to be had by being connected to other folks in the industry that are doing the same work as you and that bring new ideas and best practices. And together, I mean, that's the great thing about community, right? Together we build something better than what anyone would have built separately. So just being connected to the other folks in this domain and being able to be really familiar with and contribute to these tools that are very popular at helping other folks across the industry has inherent benefits for us as well.
Yeah, it's a hard problem though. Like, right, you solve this hard problem, and then as Shopify or, anybody goes and solves a hard problem, and then years later, there's open source tooling that you're like, oh wow, that would just be like, I could have solved this problem so much quicker, exactly what you just described. But like, you then have to weigh, is it worth rewriting it and getting the benefits and the maturity of this versus like, everything else that I could be doing. And so, I don't know, like if there is a future of Shopify to be able to like, start to migrate some stuff into the KYAML library or not, or in, like how your team thinks about that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? The configuration system management is working pretty well. So the chances that we'll turn around tomorrow and change it up are not very high, honestly. But the system that we built was for a very specific use case, and it's not the only one that we have internally. There's still some unsolved problems in the configurations management space that certainly I think KYAML functions as they exist today with the whole toolkit that's available behind them could be a really good solution for, and that is more likely to happen by far. We wanted to be really really, really opinionated with the solution that we provided to our app developers, both to help guide them and to help them avoid common mistakes that we were seeing in the previous system that we had, that this CARAM-oriented system replaced. So we actually intentionally didn't address the full spectrum of possibilities that existed at the time because we wanted to provide the best tool possible for the majority of our users on our platform.
That tool is not open source, correct? The internal Shopify one?
No, it isn't, because it's really built that specifically for the organization. I don't think it would really make sense to open source.
Right.
What you might see analogously in the future is that as part of the CARAM functions project, there is a CARAM functions registry that is still just getting stood up. There's nothing really of note in there yet, but that is a place where folks who have functions that are more generic can contribute visibly to the community, both as examples of what other folks can do and to literally share these pieces of functionality across companies.
So, okay, this is really cool. I feel like I'm understanding a lot more about how Shopify operates, both from a strategic perspective with open source, but also internally how you guys do stuff.
I actually have a few examples, real examples of us having encountered exactly the sort of situation you described a moment ago, where we have an internal implementation of something and then a community standard emerges and we're sort of faced with this question, like, do we adopt it? Is it worth the investment? And in a couple of cases, we have made that decision and we have not only switched over to the open source solution, but started maintaining it. So yeah, I could go into that a little bit if you're interested.
Yeah, that would actually be like super, super good, because it's like, I think there's a lot of like really pragmatic and in practical like decisions that like as an engineer, you're faced with, like as a software developer, you're faced with every day when you're thinking about, like, you see an open source project, you're like, oh, that's probably better. So like, I'd love to hear some of that story.
Yeah. One example is the case of our use of open telemetry. So someone on our observability team, Francis Bokshani, who leads our observability team here, was really into the idea of tracing ahead of the curve. He got started at a time when there was no clear leader, and he actually went with an internal implementation that we rolled out to production. And we had some good experiences with it, but we also sort of concluded that we didn't really want to be maintaining our own implementation ourselves. So started kind of looking out in the community what was emerging as the solution to go with. At the time that he did that, it was Open Census that seemed to potentially be the solution, but the Ruby implementation, which is what we needed, was not really maintained. So we're kind of thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe we can step up and maintain that. And right when we were making that decision, that's when Open Telemetry itself emerged. And it didn't have a Ruby implementation at all. So Francis, he said, oh, well, this is a great opportunity. Like, we have all this experience from building the internal implementation, and the community has this need for a Ruby implementation of this new standard. So this is something that Shopify is in a really good position to help out by providing. And that will also lead us to be in this better position for the long-term future, where we're using the community standard solution and being able to leverage the community documentations for how this works and really be in line with what everyone else in the industry is doing. So yeah, our observability team stepped up to the challenge there, and we're able to found the Ruby Open Telemetry implementation based on the experience gained from running Shopify's internal tracing product in production, so that we're starting from a really solid place with that, and we still maintain that to this day. Another example is that we used to use a different ingress provider, but today we use Ingress Nginx. And how that happened was we were having some issues with our original provider in terms of the feature set that it offered. And we're kind of looking around the community again for what we should perhaps adopt instead, and identified Ingress Nginx as the likely candidate. But there was a big problem. We deploy at a really, really high rate. Our core application is deployed dozens of times a day, and it has tons and tons of replicas that it needs to roll every time we do that, which means that there is a ton of endpoint churn in those clusters. And at the time, Ingress Nginx did not handle that very well. Without getting into the technical details too much, we would end up in a situation where our Ingress Nginx pods would be proliferating the number of workers they were running and eventually get killed. So what we really needed was to introduce dynamic endpoint reconciliation to be able to handle that endpoint churn in our clusters. Now, Elvin Effendi from our Reading team was looking at this problem, and he realized that we had a lot of experience with Lua and Nginx from running Nginx ourselves in our data centers in our previous architecture, and that could be applied to solve this problem in the community. So we proposed a solution, and it ended up working out really well. And with that in place, we were able to make the switch over to Ingress Nginx, which, as a fun fact, we ended up doing a lot earlier than originally planned because our original Ingress provider ended up having a major outage, and Elvin had to sort of make the decision like, we're ready to go, but we weren't planning on launching now. Well, let's just flip the switch. It's a full outage. Let's flip the switch. And we did, and we never rolled back. Ingress Nginx rollout saved the day.
Okay, so we're coming up on time, but I have a few other questions about Shopify and how it works over there. So, like, how does Shopify share, like, the management work? Like, do the dev teams and the app owners have kubectl access? Should application teams own their own clusters? Do they do that at Shopify? Like, what are your thoughts on, you guys have a really, really extensive Kubernetes setup over there. And I feel like there's a lot of lessons that you've learned over the years. So how do you guys look at who owns what and who manages what with all these clusters?
Shopify's approach in general is to have a really opinionated technical stack. And that goes throughout the stack, really, from everything from our choice of languages, like we really are a Ruby and Rails heavy shop. And for the front end technology, we use React, right through to using Kubernetes universally on the back end. And notably, for this case, the integration between those two. So our app developers, they use Kubernetes through our production platform, which is essentially a platform as a service product that production engineering builds. We have kind of an interesting balance that we strike, though, because in the production engineering model, we build the platform and we build resiliency features into it that help our applications scale and recover from outages and all of those important characteristics. But we don't actually run the applications themselves on behalf of the app owners. The app owners own their applications from start to finish, all the way through shipping them to production and making sure they work well. And it's the app owners themselves that are on call for it. So to that end, we do give them a fair amount of control within their namespace. So typically an individual application will have a namespace for, say, their production instance. And within that namespace, they're able to configure the resources as they see fit. The configuration management solution that we provide them gives them a really opinionated start that guides them in the right direction and highly restricts the ways that they can do the configuration to make sure that it ends up being deterministic and that we get repeatable deploys and all those other best practices and configuration management space baked into what's possible. But at the same time, they are able to modify arbitrary fields, kind of like the way you can do with Kustomize by writing patches. And that means that if they might start with us as an experiment, but then they grow to need something more bespoke, and they really need to tailor their infrastructure to their use case. That is something that they're able to do with our platform. That said, we are still very opinionated in other ways as well. In terms of giving folks production access, we have a developer portal that they can use to get insight into their Kubernetes resources. And we use kind of a progressive enhancement model where you don't need to learn anything about Kubernetes up front, but if you need to dive into what's happening, you really can. We're not hiding Kubernetes from you. And in that sense, our approach is somewhat similar to Kustomize, where when we need to teach you something, we're going to teach you the real concept so that you can really understand what's going on under the hood, and so that all the public resources available on what you're seeing are going to apply to you. There's no translation layer in there per se.
Well, it sounds like you guys literally are kind of doing the dream, or what I always think is the idealized dream of a good setup. Sounds really cool. I'm sticking with Shipyard, but you're tempting me. So
yeah, I think we've made a lot of good decisions over the years, and of course, like some of these weren't there to begin with. That configuration management stuff, in particular, obviously near and dear to my heart. The thing that we had there in the first place, it was a nightmare. It was not a good idea. It was template based, and Oh.
Yeah, but you guys are killing it. It's just crazy how like literally you're describing what you guys do, and I'm like, are you talking about like a hypothetical, or you actually got this all working? That's crazy. Does it work well? Does what you describe work well? Is there a lot of velocity? Do you see is it helping? Are application people happy?
What's next internally? Like where are the challenges that you want to actually make that process better?
Yeah, I mean, it is working very well for us. We have gotten a lot of velocity, as you said. I think having the strong opinions as a core part of our model, and really guiding our developers to do the right thing by default, and then be able to unlock power when they need it. That's been a really effective model for helping such a large number of teams scale such a large variety of applications. But there are new challenges every day, really, and we're constantly working to keep up with the community and make sure we're following the best practices. We are very old users of Kubernetes, so we kind of touched on this earlier. Some of the solutions that we built predate the more established practices. So we are constantly revisiting what we should be doing to make sure that we're getting the full benefits of the solutions that have emerged. Right now, one of the problems that we're addressing is that we made it really easy to create clusters because of the philosophy of trying to make them more on the restricted scope and disposable side. But now we have a ton of clusters, and it is really challenging to manage a huge global fleet of clusters. So we have some solutions that we're working on there, but that work is far from done. And that's a space where we're super interested in collaborating with other folks in the industry who are solving similar problems. As a company, we really like to collaborate technically with others and talk about our various solutions.
You know, I had two quick follow-up questions. One is, you mentioned you guys have 400 clusters. Are those all living in GKE, AKS, EKS? Do you have your own data centers? Are they spread around? I would assume that they're definitely multi-region, but are you in different clouds? And then the other question was, how many SRE and DevOps folks do you have at Shopify maintaining all this awesomeness?
Yeah, we are GKE exclusive. When we first started the project, when I was talking about the experiment that we did to see if this would work for us, one of the things we did in the early days was run Kubernetes ourselves in our own data center as part of the validation that this is a technology that we're comfortable with and that we really want to invest in. But these days we're all GKE, so all 400 plus of those are GKE clusters. And yes, they are absolutely around the globe.
How many DevOps and SRE folks do you have?
So Shopify uses a production engineering model where we have more of a platform team approach. So I guess the answer to that question would be like roughly how many folks do we have working in production engineering, which does include a handful of SREs for the platform itself. And that number depends on how you count exactly, but it's somewhere around 300.
That sounds about right for what you just described.
Another really interesting space that we work in is stateful systems on Kubernetes. That's one of the decisions that was most difficult to make in the beginning, right? When we were talking about, we're going to consolidate everything into this platform. Super easy to say once we've decided that Kubernetes is a good technology choice, that we're going to run all of our stateless stuff on there. But stateful, especially back when we were making this decision, that was far from obvious that was the right approach. And we decided to make a big bet on it and go all in with all of our stateful systems as well. And we think that's actually worked out really well for us, but it's certainly a challenging space. And we have a lot of folks who are really excited to be pushing stateful and Kubernetes forward and solving the hard problems that still exist with doing that seamlessly.
All right. Wonderful. This has been super informative. And I really do feel like you've been describing the goal state for most of our listeners. I know it's the goal state for me. And obviously, I think about platform and platform teams a whole lot. And I know Marc does as well. But this is super, super informative. One last question before we let you go. Is there any other cool open source projects that Shopify is a big part of or sponsoring or whatever that we should know about? We can put in the show notes. We don't have to talk about too much, but just anything else that we should be looking at that you guys are contributing.
We have contributed a couple of our own open source tools, notably one called Crane that's for deploys a number of years ago. That's always been a part of our stack. And another one called Cube Audit that our infrastructure security team built. We also do occasional contributions to the many different open source projects that we take advantage of from the CNCF landscape. Thanos, Prometheus, Falco, Voucher. Actually, we were maintainers of Voucher as well, which is a component of the Grafeus system. I don't think that's CNCF, but it's also maintained by our infrastructure security team.
Nice. Well, it sounds like this is a really cool place to work. Not to be too much of a commercial for Shopify, but it sounds really cool. I'm just kind of blown away with some of the factoids.
And obviously I want to highlight how the strong points of what we built so far, but there's still a lot of work left to do. And we're a company that is really heavily investing in Kubernetes, as you can tell. And we have lots of openings to work on these various spaces. And there's still plenty of hard work and challenging problems left to solve.
Wonderful. Katrina, thank you so much for coming on. This was great. I reserve the right to ask you to come back in a year to tell us what's different, because I'm excited to see. I don't know what you guys will have built by then, but it'll be super interesting. But really appreciate you coming on, and excited to see where Kustomize goes. And I will personally be checking out the KRM stuff and keeping a close eye on that. So that was something I learned today. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you would like to suggest a topic, head over to Kubelist.com. I'm Marc Campbell, CTO at Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications to their largest enterprise customers. Check us out at Replicated.com. My co-host is Benjie DeGroot, CEO at Shipyard, where they enable isolated ephemeral environments on every code change for companies of all sizes. Check them out at shipyard.build. This show is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com. And finally, don't forget to sign up for the Kubelist weekly newsletter and read previous issues at kubelist.com.